This, this is a paper that I think probably everybody in the room could be a discussant and come up with something different. So it's quite fun, and I think it's also fun sequencing to be here at the end of the day, and I so look forward to having Kornelia in particular. Are we ready to go with the mic? Yes, okay, fantastic. So really, thank you ECGI, thank you Oxford, thank you all of the organizers, and Colin, who I hope is joining us still. I was encouraged that this conference appreciates fresh research. And this really is an early stage project, but one that I've been thinking about for quite a while. And it's a meta paper about ESG, about the term ESG. So this title is not that good. This is a placeholder title in a sense. It's more boring than most of my titles, I would say. The origins and consequences of the ESG moniker. It's pretty clear and descriptive, but it's probably not going to be my final title. I've still been thinking about this because there's something deeper that I want to get across, and also as I age, I notice I need shorter titles because if I can't even remember the name of my paper, that's bad. So the title will likely change, and it might be something like Big ESG, it might be Everything ESG, the sense and nonsense of ESG. I don't know, you can all help me later maybe, but it is really this meta paper that is aiming to be an interjection into the discourse about ESG to add some context and analytical framework. Because now we're almost 20 years in to having the term ESG, and we're seeing a lot of really interesting things. So what is ESG? Many of us have written papers where we refer to that term, and then we need to drop a footnote and point to something, and yet we don't have something to point to, actually. And when we try to do it, we realize that even the word after the G, we're not sure what word to put there. I don't know if you've had that experience, but I have now multiple times, where we know the common denominator is ESG is environmental, social, governance. But beyond that, it's not actually fixed. And we're not even sure often, is it criteria? Is it factors? Is it goals? Is it outcomes? What is this? And even when you look at something like BASIC that just says environmental, social, governance, you can already start to see the mess that we're getting into, because this one says it's 3 criteria to evaluate a company's sustainability performance, which is a different term entirely. And we've also seen, and this has come out through some of the papers today too, that there can be, and the great discussion with BlackRock, that there can be different types of investing that would come under this label, of course. You have your basic ESG integration. It could be exclusionary, like negative screening, but it could be all the way to impact investing. And that might all be called ESG investing. And those things are really very different. And you start to sit in enough of these papers and conferences, and you start to realize like these are very different things that we're using this term ESG for. And then you're just a citizen of the world, and you're seeing some utter nonsense going on. You see things like startups need ESG. What does that mean? They need ESG? Something is ESG, it's not very ESG. They need more ESG. CSR ESG. A lot of academics are doing this now, putting the term together, either with a dash or a slash. They're not actually the same thing. The terms come from different places. They mean different things to many people. But because of the nonsense that we're in with this term, you often see this. In the end, most ESG CSR is just cheap talk. Now we're at the point where we're also seeing things like Elon Musk tweeting out, "I'm increasingly convinced that corporate ESG is the devil incarnate." And Mark Andreessen, a prominent venture capitalist, dirty clothes are ESG. This is ESG, it's not ESG. And now we're even seeing things like Mike Pence, the former vice president of the United States, writing op-eds recently about ESG political bias, and it is now turned into this phony social justice warrior term, and it's getting politicized, just like other terms have in the US, like critical race theory or something like that. It's become a political talking point. So this has all made me think, despite not really wanting to do a paper right now about ESG, that I needed to do I need ESG. I need to do a paper on ESG because this is happening in the discourse, yet all of us know that the flows of money into investments that are labeled ESG has been rapidly increasing and are predicted to increase even further. So this project really has 3 motivating questions that relate to right now what are the 3 parts of the paper. So the first question is really, where did ESG come from? Was it defined originally? And what were the goals of the people who created this term, ESG? So if nothing else, I think this is a contribution because we needed a place to go to have a modern history, actually, of this term before it's lost, an understanding of how it was created and why. With these observations that many of us have had about the different ways that the term is getting used, I think there's a need for some kind of analytical framework so we can at least have a common language around ways that the term is getting used. So do people mean the same thing, and what are those various meanings, the common ones at least? And then bigger picture, we are now 2 decades in to ESG, whether we've all been in this discourse for 20 years or not, it's 20 years. And that's enough time, and we're starting to see so much money and so much talk that it's really a good moment to consider what are the consequences of this strategic choice to put E and S and G together in one term. So that's what the paper aims to do. So on the first bit about where did ESG come from? Well, you know, there's a lot of discussion of ESG, but not many people talk about the United Nations. But really, if you want to go back to where the term ESG came from, the story really is that the United Nations played a critical role in bringing about ESG. But it was a collab. It was a collaboration between the United Nations and many of the world's leading financial institutions. That they are the ones that gave us ESG. So if you want to really appreciate the story of ESG as a term, you'll see that there's many ironies, such as we're now in a world where ESG is being claimed to be woke capitalism. But if you understand actually where ESG came from, that will probably strike you as kind of funny in some ways because it came from people like Goldman Sachs. That's like where it came from, like in closed door meetings with other leading financial institutions and the United Nations. So the United Nations has its own twists and turns of how it got involved in this. At the beginning of the United Nations, and scholars that write about its history, they trace that starting from its beginning in 1945, for decades it was known to kind of have either an ambivalence or an anti-business prejudice, actually. And the goals in many ways of the United Nations vis-a-vis business was to be a champion of social justice and distributive policies. So one of the most notable efforts kind of early on in the United Nations was this initiative called the New International Economic Order. And it was an initiative that was basically bringing together a coalition of developing countries under the moniker the G77 that was aiming at a reform and distribution to the global south. And the main part of the platform was regulating transnational companies in business. And that didn't go well with many of the countries that were involved in the United Nations, and especially the United States, which found this whole initiative very anti-business. So the UN spent over 2 decades, from the 70s to the 90s, working on something that ultimately just got dropped because it was too controversial, they couldn't make any headway. And it was seen as anti-business. By that time, we're into the 90s, and a huge shift had happened with globalization. And there was already a shift happening with the United Nations, where the term sustainability got coined in a UN-sponsored report in the 80s, and the UN started to shift to focusing more on human rights. But it was really in the 90s, with Kofi Annan, that there was a 180-degree shift of the United Nations towards moving towards an effort to be mutually supportive with business. And the key point that people usually point to is the 1999 Kofi Annan speech at Davos, in which he promised this concept for what became the Global Compact. And the Global Compact has 9, well, it was 9, now it's 10 principles. And the idea was to provide principles for a sustainable global society. And Kofi Annan stressed that this was important because with the rise of globalization, there would otherwise be a backlash, because we've seen this in history before. There would be the rise of all these isms, authoritarianism, fascism, et cetera. And so what we really needed to do was get ahead of that because of the concerns about potential backlash against globalization, to work towards something that was principles that business could participate in to make it sustainable and ensure security around the globe, et cetera. And in return, they said the United Nations will help provide a platform for social groups and companies to figure this out. And Global Compact was launched in 2000. It was criticized as being non-binding, too corporate-friendly, but actually it really started to pick up. There was a large number of signatories, and it was gaining traction. And at that point, and if anybody knows more on this, I'm going to start doing some interviews to understand a little better. A bunch of senior executives of financial institutions apparently started calling up Kofi Annan after the Global Compact got launched. And they said, we want more. I don't know, if there's a question about this, I can't answer it yet. There's probably a lot of reasons why they might have said they wanted more. But Kofi Annan said, sure. And he invited 55 different leading financial institutions to participate in something new, a new initiative under the Global Compact. And out of those 55 invitations, 18 financial institutions said, yes, we'd like to participate, from 9 different countries, representing over 6 trillion assets under management, and funding from the Swiss government. And what they came up with was an initiative called Who Cares Wins. And they met in 2004. So if you're just imagining the timeline, we'd had Enron and WorldCom and a bunch of talk about governance failures. And they met under Who Cares Wins. They were operating under this idea of doing something beyond, but under the auspices of the Global Compact principles. But as you can see, this is not catchy. All this thing, what is, like ESG is like a different kind of distillation that came out of this. Because the 10 principles of the Global Compact aren't easy to talk about in a catchy way. So the Who Cares initiative represented, as I mentioned, all these leading financial institutions in meetings in collaboration with the UN. And they set out a report after their meeting. This is where the term ESG was coined, in this initial report. And they set out a bunch of goals: stronger and more resilient financial markets, contributing to sustainable development, improving trust in financial institutions, et cetera. And they explained what they were trying to do through this, which was to try to figure out a way to have environmental, social, and corporate governance issues managed as part of companies' overall management quality and integrate that into factors for investment analysis. And they listed out, and there's names of folks that were involved from these institutions that participated. It's like Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, Morgan Stanley, others. And this is the group that coined ESG. And a few notable things stand out in their initial report. First, they were very deliberate about coining the term ESG. They said, throughout this report, we have refrained from using terms such as sustainability, corporate citizenship, et cetera, in order to avoid misunderstandings deriving from different interpretations of these terms. We've preferred to spell out the environmental, social, and governance issues which are the topic of this report, the underlying content. So they were really deliberate about choosing that term, and they also explained why the G. And they said, well, we put the G in because we believe that to operationalize the E and S, you need G. And further, not only to operationalize this, it's also necessary for the mainstreaming of the ESG issues. And throughout the report is a lot of language around this is normal. This is part of the normal process of investment practices, and we need to normalize and mainstream this, and G is part of that. Another interesting point from the original report is that they explained that they believed that this would be tied to having a material impact on the investment value. So the report says we might use longer time horizons to figure that out, and we may use a broader definition of materiality, but that is what we're talking about when we're talking about these ESG issues. And then they gave a list of examples, and notably, there's certain things on here that don't get often talked about, for example, from a US perspective, like corruption, but it's very significant to developing economies. But other things that get heavily talked about, for example, from a US perspective, like board diversity, weren't initially listed as an example. And I just want to note there's a few extra things that I've been discovering as I've been digging into this. One, there's multiple people who claim to be the person who coined ESG. I have a few website bios that I'll be following up with. But apparently, they considered GES because they thought G was so important. They considered SEG, but they thought that might have put the S2 forward that like Americans might not like because they might think it's too socialist. And they decided ESG was the sexiest, putting the E up front. So it was a deliberative decision, but ESG isn't inherently so sticky that we're going to have trillions of assets under management because it was just a defined term and effectively like a technocratic report. So from there, what happened? Well, there was basically a flywheel of UN initiatives, financial institutions, and institutional investors and their networks. And the paper traces basically the Who Cares Wins initiatives first started in 2004, but they met annually through 2008 in closed-door sessions, and they brought in more and more companies and people into the conversation. And they tried to tackle the different aspects that they foresaw. And so they continued, they brought in more. Then a different part of the United Nations, UNEP-FI, had commissioned the Freshfields Report, which was a global law firm giving an opinion as to fiduciary responsibilities and consistency with ESG consideration. Within a couple of years, they continued another collab between basically the UN and institutional investors and financial institutions with launching PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment, to try to promote the integration of ESG into investment analysis. There was then an evolution of the standard setters for sustainability or impact reporting, most notably GRI, which GRI itself had started after the Exxon Valdez spill and was focused on climate reporting and environmental. But with the coinage of ESG, within a few years, they shifted towards using ESG in the broader framework. And beyond that, I think we know a fair bit about what happened with asset managers and others that helped contribute to this flywheel. So within a short amount of time after, after it was coined, many people throughout the world with prominent positions of influence in talking with clients, et cetera, were diffusing the term. And with that meant that we also pretty quickly came to different usages of the term. So the original language in the report is closest to an understanding that these are factors for investment analysis. But within just, actually by the time that the Who Cares Win initiative ended, a survey of 300 fund managers said that they identified it not only as factors for investment analysis, but also as a tool about risk management, which is really not at the investor level of factors, but a process for companies to engage in to talk with stakeholders and engage in risk management practices, which is a different meaning, related but different. Beyond that, we've seen a lot of usage of ESG as either a synonym for CSR or sustainability, which are different terms and have different histories. And to some extent, this was quite nuanced by people that just think of these as so interlinked that they were using them in a way that was synonymous. But for others, this was just, I think, many people saw the same types of issues that had been discussed under CSR. They heard it being used a lot, and so they started to think, this is basically the new term for CSR. And then finally, we're starting to see a lot of usage of this as, in a sense, an ideological preference or some type of preference, like voting with your wallet as a proxy for a preference of something beyond the financial performance. And this is where you start to see this language of things like something is ESG or not ESG, and why you might also see a backlash because people think that it's become ideological. So the consequences. Well, there's, on the one hand, a story that this choice to put together E and S and G is exactly why it has succeeded in becoming a mainstream term, because by choosing ESG, they chose a term that could be globally applicable and customizable by context. So in some regions of the world, corruption might be a very significant issue. In others, board diversity might be a very significant issue. It allows for an evolution over time of the meaning, because you can start by thinking that E is mostly about climate, but then as you better understand water risks, you could understand that actually water risks might be an important part of E. We've seen a notable example of this in the US with human capital management, a new term being coined under S that wasn't originally used in other parts of the world. That's not the term that's generally used for those things, et cetera. And it does provide a big tent. And this is something that Dorothy Lund and I discussed in a paper last year called the Corporate Governance Machine, that the term ESG helped it succeed in some sense because by claiming that there was an alignment story and using a term that got rid of the baggage of CSR, it allowed for threading of the needle into the system that we already have for public company governance in particular. And for those who wanted it to be a values preference or investment tool, they could get under that tent too. And so now we have this big ESG where it means lots of different things over time and in different places. So that also comes, and it's inherently tied, I'm arguing, the flexibility of it, the big tentedness of it that allows it to succeed is also what subjects it to what I think will be just ongoing critique. Because of the flexibility and the changing time, it will be difficult to empirically show that it is tied to economic performance. Now we have lots of research on this, but we have enough research that people that want to say pro-ESG can point to stuff and people who want to be against ESG can point to stuff. We also see this huge diversity of ratings and rankings, and there is a huge amount of variation. And so some people say it's okay, this will get sorted out with time and with more disclosure and more convergence, et cetera, this is not a problem. Other people will point to that and say, this is what shows it's all just subjective nonsense or greenwashing. It can also lead people to have the wrong impression about what they're investing in, and then once they realize they've invested in bank stocks instead of solar, they think that, what is this term ESG? It also allows for sustainability arbitrage because you've got 3 different components that have internal trade-offs and tensions in many different instances. And this can also be an arbitrage not just within a company, but between the public and private divide. And it's not even just that, it's also that there will be a tension in E&S in certain business models or industries that can't be easily reconciled, and it was never clear how we would do that. So that gives rise to all the types of critiques that we see ongoing about unrealistic expectations and greenwashing. And also for even people that wanted this to succeed, if at the end of the day they think what we really got was a little bit on climate, maybe some board diversity, maybe human capital management disclosure, but it didn't fulfill the promises of what this big movement was going to be about, there's something to point to for that argument as well. So now we see that the term itself is it's almost like a life cycle of the term ESG. 20 years in, we see so many proposals about what to do with this term. Add an E, Leo Strine says, EESG. Or get rid of the G, E and S, but no G, says David Larker and Brian Tyne. And there's more, there's lots of different proposals. But those proposals wouldn't fundamentally change these challenges and critiques because you'd still have at least 2 components that would give rise to this and the flexibility that's on the other side. And so the future could be we create new taxonomies, and we start to see this with the SEC efforts in the US to try to get stronger to clamp down on greenwashing with labels. But then are we in a world where there's just many, many different terms and the everyday person can't understand it anymore? Or will we see the rise of a new term because we've realized that this is a limited, what you can accomplish under the term ESG may be quite limited. More to discuss, but I'll leave it there. Yep, thanks.
So thank you for having me. I think this is a super important paper, and I'm glad someone has written it. I will briefly first summarize what the paper is about in really few points, and then I have mostly suggestions. And I can imagine that this is the paper that, depending on what kind of discussion you get tons of suggestions where to take it. So it's fully up to Elizabeth where she takes this one. So the research question is all about the term ESG. So where does it come from? What is it used for, and what is it misused for? And my suggestion will be to name the paper ESG, two dots, from asset managers to asset managers. And I will talk about it a bit later on. But the term ESG actually, as you've heard, comes from, let's say you can pin down these two super important years, 1999, the Davos World Economic Forum, and then 2004 is the one that, let's say, if I was citing this paper, I would say that this is the one, this is where the environmental, social, and governance were pinned down. Why does it matter? So the paper is super important because trillions of dollars are being invested according to ESG principles. It's very difficult to find out exactly how much money, so I actually relied on the European regulators' recent report that says there are around 10 trillion assets under management of euros in the funds that are now, to a certain standardized way, claiming their association to ESG. These Article 8 and Article 9, so around 30% of these 10 trillion are at least, so we can apply, let's say, maybe 30% of the European AUM. Now, the fascinating part is that ESG turns out to mean different things to different people. And so I will speak about the relation to sustainability, CSR, a bit more, because it happens that all of these terms pop up. So let's start with several suggestions I have. So we have to go to the word sustainability, because you will see it in the European Commission's definition. So I love to go to fishery, because I think it's one of the very few places where we know what sustainability means for 100%. You don't fish at a rate that the fish population would be impacted, so it doesn't decline because of your fishing practices. But what does it mean in finance, right? It's much more difficult to say. Overall, there was no definition until relatively recently. The European regulator tried to bring more clarity there, and there arose the EU taxonomy. So at the moment, the paper is not mentioning this too much, and I would like to suggest to add the definition that is actually officially provided by the European Commission. That is, so sustainable finance refers to the process of taking ESG considerations into account when making investment decisions in the financial sector, leading to more long-term investments in sustainable economic activities and projects. Okay, so that's one idea. Another one is that in the paper there is a section on that relates now CSR and ESG. If you want to get into the debate, I would say again the European Commission's definition. So they also have this is really an official one. So CSR is the responsibility of enterprises for their impact on society, and therefore it should be company-led. Companies can become socially responsible by integrating social, environmental, ethical, consumer, and human rights concerns into their business strategy and operations, and following the law. So it's actually, I was thinking about it when I was preparing my class on sustainable finance, like what's the difference? And I thought that maybe ESG is a better term than CSR, and it also alleviates some of the concerns because CSR is more about the fact that we need to be as responsible as the society currently expects us to be, whereas ESG says that we need to prepare ourselves for the major future challenges, potentially. So that was my suggestion for the CSR and ESG debate. I'm not even sure to in what depth you want to go there. The next thing that comes to the next suggestion I have is about how why I would call this ESG from asset managers to asset managers. Because ESG created for many an amazing business opportunity. So I took this figure from Aswad Damodaran, who has this, he calls it the ESG gravy train. I love it. So let's start with, let's say, ESG disclosures. So you have some lobbying for more ESG disclosures, even for making them a bit more complicated, so that ESG consulting agencies can now consult firms on how to make their ESG ratings better. Then these ESG ratings are incorporated into ESG investment decisions or funds. So there is, again, there are always players who benefit from this. And then we have the ESG ratings industry, which is a chapter per se, that took up this amazing business opportunity and is now really riding the wave. And so I would say that's why I would say from asset managers to asset managers. So there is an amazing business case for this, and I think it's basically riding on the wave that we would like to have a better, let's say, better economy and better, let's say, live in a better world, if we say it in this way, and it's like a common desire. And this is an attempt of the industry that is actually, if we talk about pollution, it's a negative externality, right? And like market failures sometimes need to be need to be solved by government intervention. So I would even say that ESG and all this hype around is crowding out actually some inevitable solutions like a proper carbon taxing that eventually gonna have to come. But at the moment, amazing business opportunity for many involved. Then I have another suggestion on and that's, I would take the paper more to the ESG investing, because the term gave rise to, as I said, this amazing business opportunity. And ESG investing probably now benefits also from having a linguist on board, because as you can see, how the subtle wording differences can lead to fund invested quite differently. So this is from Goldman 2021, and they have a fund that's ESG integrated. So ESG analysis may inform how we evaluate companies and issuers. Okay, ESG aligned, there it's about negative screening. Then you have ESG enhanced, which is about how they evaluate companies, the universe of eligible securities, and our portfolio construction process. Then you have ESG impact. Capital is invested to seek to benefit from or accelerate specific ESG trends. And then there is ESG catalyst, strategies that seek to advance diversity among capital market participants. So I would say that even many, let's say, newcoming small retail investors might look at this and maybe they invest in funds that are merely ESG aligned and believe that they are investing in ESG impact. So there is a lot of subtlety, and again, that creates a lot of what I'm trying to say, that you can also cater to any preferences that are there. I would also suggest to maybe talk about the cost effectiveness of these ESG funds. So this flexibility embedded in the wording allows one, let's say, to sell something to a customer who now believes that, oh, I am having a real world impact, while as there will be one paper that also on the program that shows that probably not. So here I have an example from Vanguard S&P 500 ETF and Vanguard S&P 500 ESG ETF. And there was a nice article on Bloomberg about many ESG funds being just expensive S&P 500 indexers. So you can look at the expense ratio. So it was 0.12% for the ESG one and 0.03% for the regular one. And the correlation in performance, I tried to memorize it, it was 0.9974. So you're paying multiple times more for something that is very unlikely to have a real world impact, let's say, for effort that is one line of code. Drop if SIC code or next is equal to this and that. And at this point, I guess I would like to mention the paper by Jonathan Berg and Van Winsbergen, The Impact of Impact Investing, that shows that even under super optimistic scenarios, like through divestment, so avoiding some companies, one is not going to change the world. So actually, the authors suggest to engage rather than avoid. So that would be my comment on the pricing of these, or how to say, on the margins of these products. Then I have last suggestion, and that is if you take it to the asset management angle. I mean, you already have some section on ESG and performance. But you can mention, I mean, if you want, of course, our paper with Florian Berg and Zach Sautner, where we show that one of the major ESG ratings agencies, Refinitiv ESG, formerly Thomson Reuters or Asset4, used to win more than 1,600 articles, actually retroactively rewrites the entire ESG ratings database. And depending on when you download the data, you can also find different relation between ratings and returns. So here I have example of one firm. So the blue line on top is the download for, the years 2011, 2017, from September 2018. Then the next download is 2 years later, in September 2020. That's the teal line. So you see that the rating changed quite a bit. And then a couple of weeks later, in November 2020, the red line, here we have a change again. This is the history. So one can be very perplexed. How does this happen? What have we learned in November 2020 that made us propagate the history of this firm's ESG quality? And what we find, we don't really, it could be a coincidence, doesn't have to be. So there is actually a survey that so it is an investor pay model. Okay, so BlackRock, Goldman, they subscribe to these let's say ratings, and it creates some incentives issues. So we find that suddenly through the methodology change, it seems that the positive relation between ratings and returns has been introduced, which you might speak to the story of from asset managers to asset managers. So this is all I wanted to say. So thank you for your attention, and again, thank you for having me.
You want to take a couple of minutes to respond?
Thank you so much, Kornelia. Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you so very much. Yes, I shared this paper last week with some other friends in the Netherlands who similarly suggested incorporating the definition from the EU taxonomy and related to sustainability, and I will do that in the next draft. And I will also note, though, that I don't think that in some respect changes any of this analysis. And it actually shows, I think, how difficult that task was and how interesting it will be to watch how that gets used. In the US, what's happened is that the SEC, a bunch of commissioners at the SEC have pointed out the dangers of getting into the business of defining some of these terms, because on the one hand, they are concerned about the vagueness and amorphousness, and we see this kind of cracking down on using the label ESG and wanting to avoid greenwashing. But on the other hand, some have said, it puts us in the position of becoming an arbiter then of what is, and what I heard in the last panel, like true ESG, and they don't want to do that either, or limit the choices of investors. So I think we'll see a really interesting story happen with whether or not this becomes defined by different governments around the world in different ways. One of the things about the initial coining of the term ESG that I think in some ways helped it get mainstreamed is that it wasn't defined as a legal term of art originally, which allows the investors themselves to give content to that and be the drivers of some of that meaning. So that's I think those are all really interesting points, and the EU definitions are great for that. The ESG relationship to CSR, yes, I've said some about that in some previous work, and I'll probably say more on that as well. It's a good suggestion. And likewise with the major business opportunity, I've pointed this out also in recent work, but I haven't done the work of spelling out all the details of that, like the ESG gravy train chart does, as you pointed out, and I think it's such an excellent suggestion. On focusing on ESG investing, I've seen that Goldman Sachs taxonomy, and I think that's what I'm getting at in a sense where I think, as a discussant on my piece, I think I need another last subsection to give it a little bit more at the end, and I just haven't decided what the right thing is, because on the one hand, we could say, well, there has been a huge value to society even, perhaps, that we've had a couple decades with a different term being used, and that it was even so messy that we used a bunch of other terms at the same time and having these discussions, corporate purpose and sustainability and others, because this has given rise to, in a sense, something like what Shana Schifrin has called like the value of fog sometimes, that in a process, like this is like the rules versus standards debate in law. Sometimes when you have a standard, it has this flexibility and there's certain downsides to that, but it also allows for a conversation around certain values and also moral deliberation and figuring it out, basically, that might produce some value. But on the other hand, we now have this problem where the term ESG could, in a sense, just collapse on itself almost under the weight of all of these different things that it's being used for. And that is problematic, which might argue for an adjustment towards either this taxonomy of the world or a narrower and trying to get to more coherence on using it in particular ways. And using other terms also more precisely, like impact investing or sustainability, et cetera. And I will definitely be citing your paper. It's such a wonderful example. And it also, I think, shows that it follows as a consequence of not having a fixed term or definition related to ESG is that it allows for things like retroactively changing the effects in the database, which is another excellent example. Thanks so much.
So we have a few questions. Let me start by adding some more confusion to this ESG debate. So I have never understood ESG, especially the G part. I shouldn't be saying that at a governance conference, but I think it should be ESF. Companies should care about the finance, not anything else. Then they should care about governance or whatever, environment. But the other thing I was thinking about, I started teaching a class at NUS on household sustainability, or household ESF, environment, social and financial goals of the household. And there I care about what do you eat. I mean, if you are eating beef, your carbon footprint is 20 times than lentils. And if you're driving versus not. So I think thinking about that in your bigger theme about not just companies, but also households, and how should they be responsible? And if we actually make ultimately the households responsible for ESF, would we even need to worry about companies at all? Because if we do ground up, I think we'll take care of the problem.
Interesting.
Okay, let me start there and there.
Thank you so much. I'm Eric from Stockholm. Wonderful presentation, and you've already heard this from your friends in the Netherlands then, but I think it would be great if you included more on the EU taxonomy, and not because it would help, clarify these issues, but quite on the contrary. This discussion is really interesting to have against or in relationship to that regulation, because the goal there is to clarify the meaning here, and the criticism right now from European lawyers is that that's far from the truth. I heard from a bank in Stockholm that they right now have 100 lawyers working full-time on understanding these definitions. And why are they putting in that time? Well, because there are legal consequences tied to these definitions, right? So then when the EU rolls this out and adds even more clarity and then legal sanctions to these definitions, it's really important to have someone that can help, pointing to this and clearing up this. And I think you probably won't be able to do this by yourself, but it would be really a good time for that type of paper.
Thank you so much.
So first, congratulations for kind of keeping up the energy until the end. I mean, that was amazing because after my presentation, things were difficult. So I just have a comment. So since I know you're just looking at where the term originated, but towards the end and in the discussion, there was a lot of talk about measurement, transparency, and things like that. So what surprised me is that you didn't actually mention this whole debate about shareholders versus stakeholders, because ultimately the issue, the way I see it, is that the difficulty is capturing the stakeholders. So the environment, they're different on the social side, different stakeholders. And so this is where the term is having a difficulty in some sense. And so it's probably easier to discuss shareholder versus stakeholder, as some people do, especially I think more on the legal side. And we've been stuck with this term ESG. So just a comment that maybe that will be a way for you to bring it together towards the end.
Back to me.
You want to just take the questions and then take your chance to answer them?
Oh, sure. Okay. It's like
since you have a very broad agenda, let's take all the questions.
Great.
One of the revelations of my first trip across the Atlantic in two and a half years, right? I guess everybody similarly, has been the very different starting points of the governance debate, say in the United States versus Europe and the UK, whereas I've been hearing a lot about the sustainability directive, which to an American audience would sound like unbelievable, and the worst things one could say about the European Commission is the sustainability directive. One of the things that has struck me, though, about the ESG debate especially is it's been embarrassed by the climate change debate in a profound way. So ESG, and this really picks up the point about the stakeholders, is to some extent a distributional debate. There's an assumption that firms are going to be up and running and having earnings, and the issue is how to allocate them among the claimants to the firm, which, of course, again, to an American ear about risk-taking, the inevitability of failure, incentives, et cetera, it seems off-key in a certain way, but it's a distributional concern. The climate change issue is not about that at all. It's capital E. It's an existential issue. Either we all collectively solve this, or there's enormous failure and cost across the entire globe, across the portfolio of everybody. So there's a way in which, from my perspective, ESG is a distractor from the critical thing that needs to be solved by all firms going forward, so, I mean, I'll stop at that, but these are ideas that came literally because of a trip across the Atlantic, and so I think it's great that we're resuming this, and I hope we do more.
Let's keep the question short. So
yes. Just very quickly, I mean, the question is how much does the confusion that you're highlighting actually matter? Because ESG is a catch term, it's a buzzword, but below that, we're trying hard to find metrics that give us a meaning. And if you look, for example, at Nick's paper and others, I mean, if you look at least in the financial space, what are the metrics that people are basing their actions on, then it becomes significantly more specific. And this may not be the accurate definition of ESG or something, but it has triggered something that I think leads into a direction where we can have new equilibria, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just wondering.
Elizabeth, thanks. I think great paper to look at the CSR shift to ESG, because I think people do use them interchangeably and don't really know why that shift occurred. And of course, CSR never got much traction at all, but ESG getting enormous traction. I just wonder to what extent too the sort of arrival of ESG has somehow colonised parts of CSR, because I think a lot of people now think of CSR as just being corporate philanthropy, which was what it kind of wasn't back in the day, and it's as if other parts have flowed into ESG. The other thing I thought is quite interesting is I loved your idea about the value of FOG at the meta level, but where I think the rubber will hit the road is in the statements that corporations make to try to show that they are ESG friendly. And fascinating, 2 days ago, a raid in Germany on the basis that, a subsidiary or an arm of Deutsche Bank was greenwashing. The Australian regulators have said they're totally going to be looking out for greenwashing. And, in Australia, there's a very influential memo that says directors can be liable for breach of directors' duties if they greenwash. So I think that's where there'll be very, great specificity.
One more question. We'll give you 5 minutes to answer so that we can all go have a drink.
Yeah, Jun from Seoul National University, Korea. Since this Global Corporate Governance Colloquium, I just wanted to add something from East Asian perspective. So first, as a non-native English speaker, I was always wondering why we have 2 adjectives, environmental, social, and 1 noun, governance. So that's my first point. The second point is that, yes, having read your great paper, same things are happening in Korea. So ESG encompasses everything from stakeholderism to ESG factor investing or et cetera, and things like that. And I thought that what are the advantages and disadvantages of having such a vague term, such a large term? So from the Korean example, maybe the good thing is that Korean people are becoming more aware about climate change, social issues, and things like that. The bad thing is that all the stakeholders, the definition of ESG is different depending on who talks about ESG. So when it comes to asset owners, it's quite similar to what you described in Who Cares Wins, considering non-financial factors in the investment. But there are also Korean employees who ask to reduce dividends and raise their salaries because it's ESG. And there are also some politician who says that we need to adopt co-determination because it's also ESG. So just wanted to add that.
2 more questions.
Okay, got it. Yep.
Yeah, just very quickly, and I guess this is just echoing a bit what Jeff said, but I think from a geographic point of view, the E seems like the one area with climate change where you actually can get some sort of universality, right? And you see this with stewardship and stewardship codes, and when you look at how it's being used, right? It seems on a geographic basis you can actually operationalize it through climate change. So in that sense, I think climate really can be separated out as a bit of a different factor to operationalize the E.
Okay. One more question.
Yeah.
Nice. I didn't think I was going to get a question. This is also about unit of analysis. I think I agree with your point about CSR and the view that we have around the individual companies' philanthropic efforts, as opposed to what Luigi was talking about before, and the comparative advantage that companies have to prevent externalities, for example. I think that the unit of analysis at CSR is what we refer to now, I think, usually. Your paper is to this point that we're all unclear about this. CSR seems to be about things that companies do themselves, whereas ESG is how investors stock pick around that. To little effect at the company level, actually, to the point of some of the papers that are covered in this conference. So I think that's an important thing to look at as well. You may well cover that in the paper, which I haven't read, but look forward to. But that seems kind of important, whether it is something that's at the investor level or at the company level.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, let me give you 5 minutes, but giving lawyers 5 minutes doesn't mean anything.
Well, let me try to prove you wrong. Okay. So, Sumit, I have also heard other people suggest an F, and there's actually many more variations out there. People want H for health and all these things. And that is, in some sense, the point that I end on, is that that's the world we're in now on that. And to your point about households as a unit of analysis, I just want to take the opportunity to be clear that in this paper, I'm trying to do a lot of things, but it is a meta paper about ESG. I'm not making a normative argument about the version that we should have that might achieve whatever the true goals are of. I don't think there are any. On the EU taxonomy, yes, I definitely have been planning to do this, and I agree that in part that's why I want to add it is, well, to be more global, but also to show the difficulty of the task and that people should be watching this and to make a more holistic and thorough paper that we can point to. People have also been trying to define corporate purpose, which is a very a challenging task, let's say. Nick, yes. So stakeholders. Yeah, and in fact, I think this is part of the kind of big tentedness, is that stakeholder capitalism is another term that I didn't use just now, but it's another one that's been mashed in. And to some extent, then the focus on the business case, which was back to the original Who Cares Wins initiative, put a lot of the focus in efforts of researchers on proving the business case and the financial performance, but there's been a lot less focus on what the impact of ESG is on stakeholders, actually, which is another interesting point that your good comment reminds me of. Jeff, yeah, so I had a similar thought about the climate change debate. And in fact, I note in the paper that the year right before the Who Cares Wins initiative, there was a different effort that got launched under the auspices of the UN called the Investor Network on Climate Risk, and it was a summit on climate risk. And they actually had 70 investors representing 7 trillion assets under management, more than the Who Cares Wins initiative, focused on climate. And I do wonder, what would the world be like now if they had focused their firepower on that instead of on ESG? And so that is, in a sense, another one of these types of consequences that we can think of. There are consequences to choosing to coin a term and then diffuse it through the global kind of flywheel. I also think the distractor point is another important one, that there's real consequences. This is the stuff I've been thinking about what I want to say at the very end of this paper. And there is a danger, I think, of having it look like there's a lot happening in the world right now if the outcomes don't really materialize. And there was a great talk yesterday at the keynote on the COVID-19 incorporations talk from somebody from Mercer that had really interesting data that showed workers' expectations are very different than what executives are saying they're actually making traction on. And I think we're going to start to get an accounting or reckoning in the world. And that's a consequence to some extent, too. Tobias, so how much does the confusion matter? I think it matters in part because of Jeff's good question. The confusion matters in part because it can also give rise to the belief that there's lots happening when, in fact, maybe we're not making as much progress as people would expect. And maybe ESG has always been limited. One of the follow-up reports from the Who Cares Wins initiative said it would be value producing maybe at the margins. And it may not achieve all of the things. So I think there is some consequence to the confusion mattering. Jennifer, great comments about this interplay between ESG and CSR. I want to give credit. The fog concept comes from Shauna Schifrin in a Harvard Law Review piece in 2010. But I'm exploring that in some sense of there could be some value from this. But it's interesting, your point, that ESG has actually changed also in some sense. It's dynamic with what people think of CSR now. And I did a Google, I had a friend actually share with me this Google Ngram to show the usage of the terms over time. It's not in this draft of the paper. But ESG, of course, spiked around like 2015. But CSR has also been going up with the rise of ESG. And I think that could be partly because people are putting them together and talking about them. But there could also be something else going on. And yes, I think, right, the greenwashing, et cetera, the other points, I think is also part of what we're seeing with this stage that we're in on the ESG debate as far as consequences. June, thank you for sharing that. It's I think, a very good point that the understanding of what ESG means varies by the person and their purposes that they're using it for, and it's good to hear that that's, you know, to be validated in understanding that that is happening around the world. Dan, so yeah, geographic, the E is easier to operationalize. Many people have said this, and this is one of the things why some people say, you know, S is the big problem actually, not the G thing. And this is just part of the debate in some ways, that this is the meta discourse around ESG, that people tend to like certain components more than others, or they want to change the term, et cetera. And on the final comment, yeah, I have a little bit on the paper on this. One understanding is that CSR is what companies do, whereas ESG is investment analysis. But that's just one of many usages, actually. And so I think that the paper, that's one way that you could have a through line through some of these different usages of different understandings, but it's just one actually among many. And so what the paper really does at the end of the day in this current draft is it gives us an accounting of where the origins of this term came from. It gives us an analytical framework to think about and spot when we see it, different usages of the term. And then finally, it's an exploration, not an argument on any particular view of ESG, but an exploration of what the consequences are now that we're 20 years in, and the choice to put together E and S and G. Thank you.
So Sumit has been trying hard to save more rooms for the drinks. However, what he didn't know is that I will fill in for Colin wrapping up today's conference. And this gives me the opportunity to share my thoughts on the papers that were presented today. Let me start with the observation. No, just kidding. I think we had a fantastic sessions here with engaged speakers, great papers, truly helpful discussions. And I hope that we will continue tomorrow.